I was dressed too casually that night, a mistake I never expected to have consequences. I had thrown on a short silk robe that barely clung to my shoulders, fully unaware that my attire would catch someone's attention. I always moved through the quiet house without much thought, especially in the late hours when my husband was sound asleep and I was alone with my thoughts. But tonight, the ordinary routine took a sudden, dangerous turn. I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water, not expecting anyone to be awake. The house was supposed to be mine at that hour, silent, empty, and free of interruptions. I had planned nothing more than a quick glass of water, and then to return to bed. However, as soon as I stepped inside, I realized I wasn't alone. There he was. Bleh. My stepson stood near the refrigerator, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the room. I froze in the doorway as his gaze met mine. His eyes, usually so quick to move, lingered on me for a moment that felt all too long. There was something in his look, a mix of curiosity and something else, that I wasn't prepared to confront. He didn't look away. His eyes slid over my form with an intensity that shouldn't have happened. I should have felt embarrassed. I should have instinctively tightened the fabric around me, but I did nothing. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and charged with unspoken meaning. Leo closed the refrigerator door with a soft click. I could see the way he took a measured glance at my legs before meeting my eyes again. His expression was unreadable, yet his presence was commanding in the small kitchen. "You aren't asleep yet?" he asked, his voice deeper than I had ever heard it. The tone wasn't playful or casual. It was deliberate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I only wanted water, a simple need that had led me here. But what I received in return was far more complicated than a casual inquiry. The tension in the air was palpable, and with every passing second, the boundary between appropriate behavior and something forbidden seemed to blur. I was aware that I should retreat, that the line had been crossed before it was even clearly drawn, yet I couldn't find the will to move or to object. For a moment, the kitchen became the stage for a silent standoff. I could see his eyes, still fixed on me, searching for a sign of hesitation or desire. It was as if he was testing the limits, pushing me to react even though every instinct told me to step back. The quiet hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded like an ominous countdown, marking the seconds that I was caught between duty and impulse. Every detail in that moment was magnified. The cool tile under my bare feet, the soft rustle of my robe as I shifted, and the barely audible sound of Leo's measured breathing all built up the tension in the room. There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive dialogue, but the silence itself was loud with the promise of consequences that I couldn't yet understand. It was a moment of decision without an obvious choice. My mind raced. I knew I should have closed the door, retreated back to the safety of my bedroom, or even locked it to avoid any misunderstanding. Yet something inside me, a mix of rebellious defiance and a desire to confront the unexpected, held me in place. I wasn't ready to define this moment as wrong or even right. I was simply caught in its unfolding drama. Leo's presence was overwhelming and strangely calm. His posture was relaxed yet deliberate, as if every gesture was a carefully planned move. He stepped a little closer, his eyes never leaving mine, and his voice broke the silence with that single question that seemed loaded with both challenge and invitation. In that fleeting moment, the ordinary night shifted into something unrecognizable, a thriller in which every small action carried weight. I had crossed a boundary without fully realizing it, and now there was no simple undoing what had happened. My simple quest for water had turned into a confrontation with hidden desires and unspoken rules, and the line between right and wrong was fading fast. As I stood there, facing the consequences of my carelessness, the kitchen around us seemed to shrink. Every sound, every glance was amplified in the charged atmosphere, making the seconds stretch out like hours. Leo's quiet question hung in the air, a direct challenge to the normalcy I had always taken for granted. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my ears, but my voice failed me. I was caught between the urge to speak and the need to remain silent, to retreat, and to confront the situation head-on. The cool water I had come for seemed insignificant compared to the emotional gamble being played out before me. I realized then that nothing would be the same after this night. I had received something far more than I had bargained for, a moment that would leave a mark, a secret that would haunt every quiet night thereafter. But as the silence continued and the question lingered in the air, I knew there was no going back. I had stepped into a reality where lines had blurred and where every action from that point forward would be measured against the memory of this one charged moment. And that was when I truly understood. I had wanted water, but what I got was something far more significant. Since that evening, something changed. I began to notice him lingering on me, his eyes fixed in a way that made me both uneasy and strangely compelled. In the days that followed, every encounter carried a new weight. Whether we were in the same room or passing in the hallway, I could feel his gaze on me, bolder than before. It wasn't just the look, it was the tone in his voice when we were alone. There was a subtle shift, a quiet assurance that turned every word into a challenge. One afternoon, I was heading toward the living room after grabbing a book from my room. I tried to ignore the familiar tension building in the air, but as I passed through the corridor, I became aware of a pair of eyes tracking my every move. I stopped dead in my tracks. There he was, leaning casually against the wall with a confident smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nice robe," he said, his voice even and calm, as if he were making an offhand remark about the weather rather than commenting on something so personal. I felt my pulse quicken at his blunt observation. I turned around slowly, not ready to meet his gaze, but compelled to see what he would do next. "You should wear that more often," he continued without breaking eye contact. His tone left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't a joke or a passing comment. It was a statement loaded with intent, and I could see that he meant every word. For a long moment, I was speechless. My mind raced for a response, but my thoughts felt muddled and inadequate. It was as if each attempt to speak was swallowed by the tension that had settled between us. The living room, which only moments before had been a quiet space for reading, now felt charged, like the calm before a storm. I tried to change the subject, to break the intensity, but nothing came out. Instead, I only managed to nod weakly, feeling trapped by the situation. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Why was he saying these things? Was this just a way of teasing, or was there something deeper at play? The lack of clear answers made the atmosphere even more suffocating. Over the next few days, his behavior only intensified. In the mornings, as I passed by the kitchen or the hallway, I could feel his eyes on me. There were moments when he would comment on the way I dressed or even how I moved, each remark delivered with a precision that left little room for a simple misunderstanding. His glances weren't just accidental, they felt deliberate, as if every look was designed to test a boundary I hadn't even realized I was crossing. One evening, while I was tidying up the living room, I caught him standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, merely watching as I moved about. When I finally turned to acknowledge him, he stepped forward. "I noticed you've been avoiding me lately," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it seemed meant only for my ears. His statement wasn't accusatory, but it carried an undeniable weight. I felt a mix of irritation and something else I couldn't quite name. I opened my mouth to protest, to say that I hadn't been avoiding him, but the words stuck. Instead, I simply stood there, my hands frozen mid-motion. It was clear that any attempt to confront him would only invite further escalation. I could see that he was serious. There was no playfulness in his eyes now, only a stark, unsettling resolve. That night, as I lay in bed trying to process the unfolding events, the memory of his steady, intense gaze lingered. I knew that whatever had begun that first night was now spiraling into something neither of us could easily control. Each glance, each offhand remark, was pushing the boundaries further, and I found myself less able to muster the strength or the words to resist. I realized I was standing at a precipice, caught between my desire to keep things normal and the undeniable pull of the dangerous unknown. The tension was mounting, and every encounter left me more uncertain about the path ahead. By the time I closed my eyes that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. My husband had gone on a business trip, leaving me home alone, or so I thought. In reality, Leo remained. I had convinced myself that if I simply avoided him, things would eventually settle back into their old rhythm. I believed distance might dissolve the tension that had been slowly building since that fateful night. But that evening, as darkness settled over the house, Leo made it impossible to ignore his presence once again. I was moving through the dimly lit corridor on my way to the living room when I sensed him. Before I could even adjust my pace, his voice broke the silence. "I see you looking at me," he said quietly, almost as if he were stating an obvious fact rather than making a provocative remark. The sound of his words stopped me in my tracks. I wanted to retort sharply, to assert myself and put an end to this unsettling game, but something inside me froze. Instead of sparking an argument, my body simply halted. The brief moment stretched into an eternity as I stood there, caught between indignation and an inexplicable attraction to the tension that pulsed between us. Leo didn't wait for an answer. He rose from his seat and stepped closer, his movements deliberate and measured. "Why don't you tell me to stop?" he asked, his tone steady, laden with an intensity that left no room for casual dismissal. His words were not a demand. They were a challenge, a silent provocation that cut through the thick air of uncertainty. I hesitated, my mind reeling. Had I already crossed some invisible boundary? Or was this all a twisted game he was intent on playing? I couldn't decide whether to speak or to retreat further. My heart pounded loudly enough for me to hear it in the quiet space between us, and every instinct screamed for me to step back. Yet, I remained rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of fear and something else, an undefinable need for confrontation. In that charged moment, the room shrank to the narrow space between us. The earlier resolve to avoid him dissolved into a haze of conflicting emotions. I recalled the first night, the hesitant glances, and the unspoken promises that had been lurking beneath every interaction. Now, as his gaze bore into me and his question echoed in my ears, I felt as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, one step away from a fall I wasn't sure I wanted to take. "Tell me to stop," Leo repeated softly, as if he were giving me a chance to decide our fate. His eyes searched mine, looking for a sign, a defiant spark, perhaps, or a simple refusal. But all I could muster was silence. I didn't know if my silence was defiance or surrender. It was just an inability to confront what was happening head-on. I considered the consequences of speaking. Had I inadvertently encouraged him by not objecting before? Or was I simply too entangled in this dangerous game to extricate myself now? Every rational thought was drowned by the overwhelming force of the moment. His presence, so palpable and unyielding, left me no room to maneuver. I was caught between the impulse to maintain my distance and the magnetism of the challenge he posed. The question hung in the air, its implications resonating in the quiet of the empty house. My mind raced through a whirlwind of doubts. Should I have said something? Was my silence an admission of complicity, or was it merely a paralyzed reaction to a situation spiraling out of control? As I stood there, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, a mundane background noise that suddenly felt ominous. Leo's gaze never wavered, and his proximity made it clear that he was not going to let this encounter end until I made a choice. My thoughts were a tangled mess of uncertainty and hesitation. I didn't know how to respond. Not because I lacked the words, but because every word I might say seemed loaded with irreversible consequences. In that instant, it became painfully clear. The line I had once thought could be redrawn was now irrevocably erased. And as his question echoed in my ears, I realized that the boundary between right and wrong had vanished completely. I didn't know what to say, or even if I wanted to speak at all. The silence between us had become an answer in itself, a dangerous admission of everything left unsaid. The day passed as if nothing had happened, yet both of us knew the truth. Leo no longer avoided me. His looks were long and unguarded, and his presence was palpable even in an empty room. That evening, I was once again home alone. Rain pattered steadily against the window, and a dim lamp cast soft shadows across the room as I sat with a book in my hands. I knew he was nearby. The quiet of the house did little to mask the tension that now seemed to seep from every corner. I didn't feel surprised when he entered. Without knocking or announcing himself, he appeared in the doorway as if his presence was inevitable. "May I?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made my heart tighten. Before I could muster a response, he moved toward the couch and sat down beside me. I remained silent. My mind raced to catch up with the rapid changes in our unspoken agreement, a shift from avoidance to confrontation, from hesitation to an undeniable closeness. I tried to process his sudden ease, the way he bridged the distance that had long separated us. Leo slowly ran his hand along the back of the couch, deliberately closing the gap between us. His fingers stopped just a few centimeters from touching mine, as if he was testing the space between us. "You know there's something between us," he said in a low, assured tone. The statement was simple, but its implications were explosive. I wanted to object, to say that nothing should come of this, that I was not ready for what his words hinted at. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, I found myself unable to speak. My protest died on my lips, lost in the intensity of the moment and the rapid shift in our relationship. For so long, I had tried to maintain a safe distance, hoping that avoidance might bring back the normalcy of before. But tonight, normalcy was a concept long abandoned. Without another word, Leo's hand moved closer. I watched, transfixed, as his fingers inched toward mine with deliberate care. The touch was light, a mere graze at first, almost accidental in its gentleness. His hand met mine slowly, a subtle yet undeniable connection forming between us. The contact was soft, as if he wanted to confirm something he had long suspected. I felt a ripple of heat spread through me, not a surge of passion, but a quiet acknowledgement that nothing could be undone now. The quiet of the room was punctuated only by the sound of the rain outside and the steady beat of my own heart. I could feel the sincerity in his gaze, a look that was as direct as it was revealing. In that gaze, there was a mixture of determination and vulnerability, a silent confession of the feelings that had been building for too long. It wasn't just the physical proximity that unsettled me, it was the truth in his eyes. He was no longer hiding behind casual glances or evasive remarks. He was here, fully present, and it was impossible to ignore what was unfolding between us. I was caught in the middle of a decision that I had been avoiding for weeks. Part of me still clung to the idea of keeping our interactions strictly off limits, to denying that any real connection existed. But the warmth of his hand and the certainty in his tone challenged every rational thought. I could no longer separate my desire for solitude from the magnetic pull of what he offered, a dangerous blend of risk and intimacy. There was no dramatic crescendo or loud declaration. Instead, it was a quiet, measured movement toward an inevitable collision. Leo's hand on mine was both a question and an answer, a signal that everything had changed irrevocably. I felt every small detail, the softness of his skin, the deliberate pace of his touch, the unspoken promise in his voice. For a long moment, time seemed to stand still as I weighed my options. My mind urged me to retreat, to pull away, and reassert the boundaries I had once believed were sacrosanct. But my body, overwhelmed by the simplicity and sincerity of his touch, refused to move. I did not pull away. In that instance, nothing was said that could reverse the course we were on. The space between us had vanished, replaced by a raw, undeniable reality. It was as if every moment of avoidance, every hesitant glance we had shared before, had led us to this point, where our true selves, unburdened by pretense, finally stood face to face. The rain continued its steady rhythm outside as I let the warmth of his hand sink in. The moment was charged with unspoken agreements and new possibilities, even as I wrestled with the consequences of every decision yet to be made. I could sense that by the time morning came, the world outside might be the same, but inside, everything would have shifted. And I did not pull away. Next night, I no longer tried to avoid him. I knew he would come, and he came. I found myself standing before his door, pausing as if time had slowed. I could already sense his presence behind that closed door, a presence that had haunted my every thought these past weeks. Steeling myself, I stepped forward and pushed the door open. There he was, standing by the bed, as if waiting for me all along. The room was dim, lit only by the muted glow of a bedside lamp and the soft patter of rain against the window. I hesitated only a moment before moving further into the space. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I took a tentative step toward him. Before I could speak, his hands reached out and found mine. I felt his warmth instantly, the heat of his skin, the steady rhythm of his breath. In that instant, the boundary between what was acceptable and what was forbidden felt dangerously close. I closed my eyes for a split second, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging within me. Then, suddenly, a sound shattered the silence. My phone vibrated on the bedside table, its screen coming alive with light in the darkness. The name Mark flashed on the screen. A man was calling, a reminder of a life I once knew, a part of me I had tried to bury. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from that glowing name. Leo's hands tightened around mine. He did not let go, holding on as if trying to anchor me in the moment. He waited, his eyes searching mine for a decision I hadn't yet made. I knew I had to choose, though every fiber of my being screamed in conflict. On one hand, there was the familiar call of the past, a reminder of who I had been. On the other, there was the undeniable pull of what was unfolding between Leo and me, a new chapter that had begun without warning. I glanced down at the phone again. Its vibration persisted, and Mark's name shone steadily on the screen. It was a symbol, almost a curse, of my former life, a life of obligations, expectations, and the role I had always played. Leo's presence, so close and so insistent, now forced me to confront the duality of my existence. "Don't answer," Leo said softly, his tone almost pleading. His voice was low, full of an intensity that left no room for discussion. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as his words echoed in the charged silence. It was as if he was urging me to seal off the past, to let it vanish into the shadows. But I had made that choice before, had I really? Every time Mark's name appeared on my screen, it reminded me of a promise, a duty I once felt obligated to honor. In that suspended moment, with the phone still buzzing and Leo's warm hand holding mine, something inside me broke. A sudden surge of resolve, mingled with a piercing pain of realization, forced me to make a choice. I sharply tore my hand away from his grasp, stepping back abruptly, as if an electric shock had passed through me. Leo's eyes flashed with confusion and then disappointment. "So, this is how it is?" he murmured, his voice cracking ever so slightly, as if the weight of the moment was too heavy to bear. I stood there in silence, the only sound the persistent vibration of the phone and the soft murmur of the rain outside. He said nothing more. Instead, he simply took a step back, his body language silently giving me permission to leave. The look in his eyes was a mix of sorrow and resignation, a clear signal that he understood this was the end of what might have been. I felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability as I reached for the phone. Without looking back at Leo, I accepted the incoming call. My hand trembled slightly as I held the phone, but I knew what I had to do. I turned and walked out of the room, each step heavy with the gravity of my decision. The corridor outside was dark and silent, the air thick with the unspoken truths of the past few weeks. I kept walking, not daring to glance back at the door that had just closed behind me. I knew deep down that there would be no next time. The choice I had made tonight was final, a clear line drawn in the sand between who I was and who I had become. As I made my way through the quiet hall, I could feel a profound shift within me. It wasn't relief that settled over me. It was something far more complex and painful, a sense of loss, as if a part of me had been irrevocably left behind. The call continued, a constant reminder of the life I was now leaving behind. With every step, I felt the distance between my old self and the person I was trying to forge in the shadows of these forbidden moments widen. The night was full of quiet certainties and stark decisions. By the time I reached the end of the hall, the reality was undeniable. Nothing would ever be the same again. I paused just outside the room, taking one last deep breath before stepping into the unknown. The weight of the decision pressed on me, but I also felt an odd sense of liberation, an acceptance of the inevitable consequences of my actions. And as I stood there, phone in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment marked both an end and a beginning.